There's a certain peace that comes with owning a lake cabin. The stillness of the water in the early mornings, the way the sunlight spills over the tree line, and the echo of loons calling across the water, it's the kind of place people dream of retiring to. For me, this cabin wasn't just a vacation home, it was my sanctuary. I bought it outright after years of hard work, blood, sweat, and sacrifice. But if there's one thing I didn't factor into my dream, it was the homeowners association. They were never supposed to have jurisdiction over my land. The cabin predated their subdivision by decades. Yet, over time, as developers pushed new neighborhoods closer to the water, the HOA started acting as if they owned the entire lake and everything around it. That's when the trouble started. From the moment I moved in full-time, I noticed the tension. A handful of HOA board members, led by the most infamously entitled woman I'd ever met, who everyone just called Karen, made it their mission to try and control me. Karen believed that the lake should be communal. Her version of communal, however, didn't mean neighbors sharing the water respectfully. No, she meant the HOA dictating who could use the shoreline, when boats were allowed to dock, and even how the private cabins that weren't in the HOA should be maintained. Naturally, I ignored her little rules. They weren't laws, and they sure as hell didn't apply to my deed. But Karen hated that. She began harassing me. First, it was petty things, notes taped to my door demanding I cut down trees that spoiled the lake view for HOA residents. Then it escalated to calling the county sheriff about my dock, claiming it was an illegal structure. Of course, the sheriff came, looked at my paperwork, and laughed it off. But Karen didn't take embarrassment well. By the time summer rolled around, she and the HOA board had tried every trick in the book to push me off my own property. They even filed bogus complaints with the county. Most folks would have caved, sold their place, and left. But I wasn't raised to be pushed around, and I sure wasn't about to let some power-drunk HOA Karen steal my land. So, I fought back the right way. I gathered every complaint, every false claim, every letter she'd sent, and built a case. I reached out to the state attorney general's office, not just for myself, but for others who'd suffered under her harassment. Turns out, I wasn't the only one. Several non-HOA property owners around the lake had faced the same kind of intimidation. The Attorney General agreed to meet with me personally at the cabin to discuss the matter. That alone told me how serious this had gotten. And of course, the exact day the AG was scheduled to visit. That's when Karen decided to go completely unhinged. The morning of the meeting felt different. I woke up before dawn, brewed a pot of strong coffee, and sat on the porch overlooking the misty lake. Normally, that kind of stillness calmed me. But that morning, it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. I knew this wasn't going to be a casual meeting. The Attorney General's office doesn't just send someone to sit at a lakeside cabin for idle chit-chat. No, when the AG himself decides to show up, it means there's a storm brewing behind the scenes. And if the HOA had been crossing legal lines, the storm was about to land squarely on their heads. Around 10 o'clock, a black SUV rolled down my gravel driveway. Out stepped two men in dark suits, one was a staff attorney, the other the Attorney General himself. Now, let me tell you something, the AG had the kind of presence that made you sit up straighter without even realizing it. He wasn't loud. He wasn't dramatic. But when he shook my hand and looked me in the eye, I felt like every word I spoke was going to matter. "Thanks for meeting with us in person," he said, his voice even but serious. "We've been reviewing your file. Quite a stack you've built." "Trust me," I said with a half laugh, "that's only half of it. If I printed every email and bogus notice Karen and her HOA sent me, we'd need a semi-truck." That got the first smile out of him. We settled inside the cabin, at the big oak table I'd built myself years ago. I laid out documents, deeds, maps, copies of county approvals, sheriff's reports clearing me of the HOA's claims. I wasn't exaggerating when I said I had a fortress of evidence. The AG staff attorney flipped through the stack, whistling under his breath. "This isn't just harassment," he muttered. "This looks like targeted abuse. They've overstepped every boundary of jurisdiction." The AG leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "And you're not the only one." "No, sir," I replied. "A couple down the shoreline got bullied into selling their property. Another family had their dock destroyed mysteriously after refusing to pay bogus lake fees. Karen thinks she owns this whole lake, and anyone who stands in her way gets buried in threats and paperwork." The AG nodded slowly, absorbing it all. "We're already investigating HOAs across the state for overreach. Your case might be the keystone that ties this together." I could feel the weight of his words. For the first time in months, I thought maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was coming to an end. And that's when it happened. The cabin door burst open without warning. No knock. No courtesy. Just the sound of wood slamming against the wall. "What is going on in here?" There she was. HOA Karen, in all her glory. Her blonde hair was teased up like she'd just come from a salon, oversized sunglasses perched on her head, and a clipboard clutched in her perfectly manicured hand like it was a sword. She looked around the cabin with a mix of outrage and disbelief, like she'd caught me holding a town hall meeting on her lake. The AG staff attorney nearly jumped out of his seat. The Attorney General himself raised an eyebrow, calm, but visibly annoyed. But me? I just sighed. Because of course, she would pick this moment. "Karen," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You can't just walk into my house." "This isn't your house," she snapped, stabbing a finger in my direction. "This cabin falls under the jurisdiction of the Lakeside Community HOA, and you are in violation of at least 16 bylaws." The AG slowly turned his head toward me, then back toward her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the kind of weight that made the air still. "And you are?" Karen blinked at him, clearly thrown off. But only for a second. She squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. "I'm the president of the Lakeside Community Homeowners Association. And whoever you are, you need to leave. This is HOA business." I swear, if looks could kill, the staff attorney would have dropped right there. The AG, though, didn't flinch. He just studied her with the same expression he might use on someone who walked into court without knowing who the judge was. And right then, I knew, Karen had no idea who she had just stormed in on. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Even the loons outside seemed to pause their calls, as if the entire lake was holding its breath. Karen, still clutching her clipboard like it was some kind of legal weapon, marched straight up to the table. She leaned over my stack of documents, her perfume filling the air like an invasive cloud. "These papers," she said, flipping through the stack without asking permission, "mean nothing. The HOA has already voted. Your dock is illegal, your cabin is in violation of community standards, and frankly, you're creating an unsafe environment for families who actually belong here." I didn't even bother arguing. Not yet. I just sat back, waiting. The Attorney General, however, didn't share my patience. He calmly reached out, pulled the papers back from her manicured hands, and set them neatly in front of him. Then he looked her squarely in the eyes. "Mrs.?" he asked, deliberately leaving the name hanging in the air. "Ms. Karen Fletcher," she said sharply. "President of the Lakeside Community Homeowners Association." The AG gave the faintest smile, the kind that wasn't warm, it was sharp, like a blade. "Well, Ms. Fletcher, let me introduce myself. I'm the Attorney General of this state. And you have just walked into an active legal meeting without permission. For the first time, I saw Karen's confidence flicker. She blinked rapidly, her jaw tightening as if she was trying to process what she'd just heard. But true to form, she recovered quickly. Well, she said, adjusting her sunglasses on top of her head, that doesn't change the fact that this property is subject to HOA bylaws, and we have the authority to enforce them. You can flash whatever fancy title you want, but rules are rules. The staff attorney nearly choked on his coffee. I bit my tongue to keep from laughing. The AG, on the other hand, leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. His tone remained calm, but there was steel underneath every word. Ms. Fletcher, let me be very clear. This cabin is on private land. According to county and state records, it was built long before your HOA was established. Therefore, your association has no legal jurisdiction here. None. Karen's face turned red, whether from embarrassment, anger, or both, I couldn't tell. That's not true, she snapped. The entire lake is part of our community. The residents voted on it. That may be what you told them, the AG said evenly, but votes do not override state law. You cannot impose governance on property owners who never signed your covenants. In fact, attempting to do so may constitute fraud and harassment. The word fraud hit Karen like a slap. She froze, blinking rapidly, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Finally, she found her voice again. This is outrageous. You're taking his side. Do you even know the trouble he's caused? He refuses to maintain his shoreline, his dock blocks the view of other residents, and he parks his truck where people can see it. I almost laughed out loud at that last one. My old F-250 might not be pretty, but it was parked on my land. The idea that she thought it was an offense worthy of HOA discipline was so absurd it bordered on comedy. The AG, however, didn't crack a smile. He studied her like a scientist might examine a strange insect crawling across his desk. Then, in a voice that could have cut glass, he said, Ms. Fletcher, your behavior today only reinforces the complaints we've received about your association. You've unlawfully entered this man's home. You've attempted to seize private documents during a legal meeting. And now, you've openly admitted to trying to assert authority over land outside of your jurisdiction. Do you realize how serious that is? The color drained from Karen's face. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked unsure of herself. She opened her mouth to protest, but the AG wasn't finished. I suggest you leave this cabin immediately, he said firmly, before we add trespassing to the list. The room went dead silent again. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Karen stood there, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her clipboard trembling in her grip. For a moment, I thought she might actually double down, launch into another tirade. But something in the AG's tone, something in the way his staff attorney was already taking notes, must have told her she was out of her depth. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed out, the door slamming so hard behind her the windows rattled. The AG leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and gave me the faintest smirk. Well, he said, that was informative. I chuckled, shaking my head. You have no idea. That's just a Tuesday with Karen. The staff attorney finally let out the laugh he'd been holding in. But for me, the encounter was more than funny, it was a turning point. Because now, the Attorney General had seen her behavior firsthand. And I knew, deep in my gut, that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. After Karen stormed out of the cabin, the door still rattling from her dramatic exit, the Attorney General didn't say anything for a long moment. He just sat there, fingertips pressed together, eyes fixed on the door like he was watching the last echoes of her entitlement fade into the trees. Finally, he turned back to me. Well, he said, his voice calm but heavy, I was going to ask you for examples of her behavior. But I think we just got one, didn't we? I laughed under my breath. That was mild compared to some of the stunts she's pulled. You should have seen the time she called the sheriff, because I was grilling on my own porch. The staff attorney raised an eyebrow. Grilling? That's a violation now. In her world, yes, I said, shaking my head. She said the smell of barbecue polluted the lake air. That actually got the Attorney General to crack a small smile. But the humor didn't last long, because he quickly shifted back into business mode. Here's what's going to happen, he said, leaning forward. We're going to open a formal investigation into this HOA. We've already had complaints, but your case ties it together. With what we just witnessed, along with the documentation you've provided, we have grounds to act. For the first time in months, I felt real relief. Not just hope, actual relief. Like the weight I'd been carrying around was finally starting to lift. But the AG wasn't finished. He tapped the table with one finger, each word deliberate. I need you to understand something. These people will push back. They'll spread rumors, try to intimidate you, maybe even double their efforts before we shut them down. Are you prepared for that? I looked him square in the eye. I've been living with it for 2 years. I'm more than ready. He nodded once, satisfied. Good. Then let's move forward. Karen's last stand. True to the AG's warning, Karen didn't go quietly. Over the next 2 weeks, the HOA sent out frantic emails to residents claiming I was trying to steal the lake from the community. They accused me of being in league with corrupt politicians, and even suggested that the Attorney General was only investigating because I'd bribed him. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so pathetic. But here's the thing, the more they shouted, the more attention they drew. And when attention comes, so does scrutiny. Reporters showed up. Local news ran a segment on HOA overreach at Lakeside. Suddenly, it wasn't just my fight, it was public. And Karen. She tried to keep her iron grip on the HOA board. But her neighbors, the very people she claimed to protect, started questioning her. Why were dues so high? Why was she targeting cabins that weren't even under HOA jurisdiction? Why did she spend so much time harassing people instead of maintaining the community she was supposed to represent? The cracks in her little empire started spreading fast. The knock at the door. One evening, just before sunset, I heard a knock at my cabin door. I half expected another ambush from Karen. But when I opened it, 2 uniformed officers were standing there with papers in hand. Sir, one of them said, we're serving notice. The state has filed an injunction against the Lakeside Community HOA pending investigation. Effective immediately, they are barred from enforcing bylaws outside their jurisdiction. I swear, I almost hugged those officers right there on my porch. Word spread like wildfire. The HOA could no longer harass non-members. They couldn't send bogus fines, they couldn't trespass, and they sure as hell couldn't storm into cabins like mine pretending to hold power. And for Karen, that was the beginning of the end. The collapse of Karen's kingdom. The Attorney General moved fast. Within months, the investigation uncovered years of misconduct. Fines misused. Dues inflated without explanation. Selective enforcement of rules against anyone who dared oppose Karen. It turned out my cabin wasn't her only target. She had driven at least 3 other families to sell their lakefront properties at cut-rate prices, properties that were later snapped up by her friends on the board. That wasn't just bullying. That was racketeering. The state hit the HOA with heavy penalties. Several board members resigned in disgrace. And Karen. She was removed as president, banned from holding office in any HOA in the state. But the best part, the part that still makes me grin when I think about it, was the day I saw her out by the lake, standing in front of a small crowd of angry neighbors, trying to explain herself. She still had that clipboard in hand, waving it like it could protect her from the truth. But this time, no one was listening. For once, her power was gone. Freedom at the lake. These days, the lake feels different. The air is lighter. The water's calmer. I can sit on my porch with a cold beer, grill steaks on my smoker, and watch the sunset, without worrying about some HOA letter showing up the next morning. Neighbors who once stayed quiet out of fear now stop by to chat. We laugh about the reign of Karen, and some of them even thanked me for standing up when they couldn't. And me. I keep a copy of that injunction framed on my wall, right above my oak table. A reminder that sometimes the fight is worth it. Because here's the truth, bullies only win if you let them. And when Karen stormed into my cabin that day, she didn't just pick a fight with me, she picked a fight with the law. And the law won.